Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome back to this Pong creation series. In the last video, I went over Unity's input system for ascribing key bindings to certain player inputs. In this video, I'm finally going to start going over using Unity's visual scripting graph to create game behaviors. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Window, Visual Scripting, and I'm going to open the Visual Scripting graph. However, by default, since we don't have any graphs, script graphs, or state graphs, nothing is actually going to open up here. So the first thing we're going to do is create something called a script graph asset. So I'll click on Assets or right click. I will go to Create. I will go to Visual Scripting and I will select a script graph. And in this instance, since we're creating the script graph for the start screen, I'll very simply call this start screen script graph. Now that we've created this script graph, I will double click on it to open it up. And here is a base script graph. Here's where you'll actually view the nodes and connections. Here's the blackboard for generating variables within all kinds of scopes. And here's a basic graph inspector for taking a look at whatever node we have selected. Now that we have a script graph asset generated, the next thing we need to do is create a component called a script machine, which allows us to attach a script graph asset to a game object for use in the game. So for that, I'm going to select the main camera object. I'm going to click Add Component, and very conveniently, I'm going to click Script Machine. Once this script machine comes up, I'm going to come down here to the graph and select our Start Screen Script Graph. Now that we have a script graph attached to our script machine, whatever behavior we define in this visual scripting graph is actually going to happen in our game. Before we start adding certain behaviors to this script graph, I need to go into the player settings and tweak a few things. So to do that, I'll click Edit. I'll go down to Project Settings. I'm already on the Visual Scripting tab. And the thing I need to do is I need to click on this Type Options. I need to scroll down to the bottom, and I need to add a very particular type to this set of options. So I'll click the plus sign, add a new type, open up the search bar, and the type I'm adding is something called uQuery extensions. I will select that type, then I will click Regenerate Nodes. I'll give it a second here to recompile. uQuery extensions is how we are actually going to get a hold of our particular buttons that we created in a previous video using the UI builder. This allows us to actually grab those buttons and assign functionality to their clickable callback definitions. Sometimes it can hang up like this, even if you only add one type, which is a little disappointing, but it's kind of the state of things currently with visual scripting. However, we have now successfully added uQuery extensions to our type options for visual scripting, which is going to make it much easier to actually access these nodes. So now that I've done this, I'm actually going to open the Start Screen Script Graph back up and get into doing some visual scripting here. So the first thing I need to do is, since what we are doing is assigning a callback, the first thing the scene needs to do is actually get a hold of the button and assign this callback. In order to do this, we are going to have to add a special event, a lifecycle event, which we are all basically used to from using mono behavior, and that is the onStart event. So we'll type onStart, And in here we have the lifecycle events on start, so we will select that. This runs as soon as the actual scene starts, which in this event is very specifically the script machine. When the script machine game object starts, it will actually run this code. However, which code do we have to run? Well, we have to query for the button element called start button, defined in our UI builder, and then assign a callback to it using C# code, which gets into something we have not done yet in this tutorial series, which is actually write code using Visual Studio. However, the first thing we need to do is actually grab a hold of our visual tree asset, which is done through our Blackboard here by creating something called a scene variable. So since the scope is within this scene, I'm going to select scene, and probably what we could do is use graph, but if I give it a scene scope, then it makes sense that it can work throughout different objects in the scene. So I'll select scene. I need to put a new variable name. So the variable name I'm going to pick here is start screen UI. Then I'll click the add button. Now I have to grab a certain type, and to take a look at which type we need, I'm going to grab the main camera, and I'm going to go to our UI document. And if we go down to source asset, we have our start UI visual tree asset. And if you double click to open this up, what actually comes up is our start UI.uxml object from the UI builder. This is actually what we are trying to get a hold of, because nested within this is our start button and is our exit button. Therefore, we're trying to get a hold of this UXML object here. So I'm going to close this again. I'm going to bring the script graph back up, and the type I'm going to type in here is something called UI document. Select UI document. Now, because the UI document is actually on our main camera, when I choose an option to select the UI document, it will pick the main camera, but that's correct because the main camera has the UI document component. Once I have this scene variable set up like this, next thing I need to do in the graph is actually get a hold of that scene variable. And that's not so bad. We come over to the graph, I right click, open the fuzzy finder, and I'm going to type get variable. And I'm going to go down to get scene variable, since that's where we defined it. And inside of this selection here, I'm going to say start screen UI, which is what I named the variable right here. Now that I have a hold of this UI document, which is essentially what this is actually going to grab the UI document component off of the main camera game object, which is exactly what we want. The next thing we need to do is actually grab the visual tree option, the visual tree object from this document, so this source asset. So now we've got a hold of this UI document component. Now we need to grab the start UI visual tree asset. This is extremely similar to essentially saying GameObject.getComponent of type UI document, and then once we have access to that UI document, we just say UI document.source asset, and that will actually grab our start UI. That's how we would do it in C#. In the visual scripting graph, this is a little different. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to click on this little nodule here, drag over, and then left click again. And this is going to bring up the fuzzy finder again. And the fuzzy finder is smart at understanding which types are actually relevant to our selection. So that filters out the types a little bit, but what we're going to start by doing is to type UI document. And notice that this brings up the UI document option, but it also has a little arrow, which means there's other options. So we will click on UI document, and the option we need is we need to actually get the root visual element. Now that we have the root visual element, which is, once again, that's our .uxml file inside of our UI builder, the next thing we need to do is do something called query the root visual element for the specific UI element that we are searching for. This is something you can also do in C# code, and you do it essentially the same way. You grab you grab the actual UI document, you grab the actual tree asset, you grab the tree's root visual element, and then you query for the element you're looking for. So in this instance, I will I'll click on this little nodule here, drag over, left click again, and I have to grab a very specific node, and this is actually the node that we added earlier in our type options, and that node is something called uQuery extensions. There's a couple options here. If we go down here to query, we have to take a note that what it returns to us is a result, which is an actual query builder object. It's not filtered down all the way to the specific query we're looking to. It's not filtered down all the way to the specific element that we're actually looking for. So something that makes this a lot more clean is to make sure that instead of using the query extensions query option, you actually just use the shorthand Q option. And if you take a look, the result is the actual element, not just the containing object. So what we'll do is we're going to select the option that requires a singular class name, not a group of classes. That's this one. So we will select this node. We now have a uQuery extensions node. And remember, this will not show up if we do not add it to our types in the project settings. So now the next thing we're going to do is notice this is the first option that actually has an input, little input caret here. So we are going to drag our onStart option into this, and we now have a functioning trigger for when the scene begins. OnStart will trigger this uQuery extensions, and that will actually grab the variable, get the root visual element, feed the root visual element into this node. In order to query for a specific object, we have to give it a name, and the name for this is actually the name that we gave our button element, which is actually start button. So in the previous video I said it's important to remember whatever you name this, because that is how you actually grab this element specifically. It is very specifically by the name we gave it, which is start button. So if I come over here, open up the graph again, in here I just need to type start button. And that is essentially how you query for a specific UI builder visual element. It's not too difficult, but it did take a little bit of study for me to figure out how to do that. Alright, so for the next part, to actually add some kind of behavior to this, I'm not familiar with any nodes, and the post on Stack Overflow I listed that was asking about nodes, nobody's responded to yet, and the forum posts I posted hasn't had a response yet. So instead of waiting for a specific node that will do this, instead of what I wound up doing was very simply writing a custom node using C# code, which is going to allow us to complete this behavior. So in order to write that node, we are going to actually utilize Visual Studio. And to make this work, I am actually going to have to write a C# script, and I'm going to have to create a C# script. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on Assets, and then I'm going to open my Editor Flow window. And I'm actually going to add a new directory called Visual Scripting. This is going to keep things a little more organized. Real quick, I'll drag the graph asset into the Visual Scripting folder. I will then select the Visual Scripting folder. And this is going to give me the ability to generate a new class inside of this file. So real quick, a little bit of forethought and strategizing for the future. We have the start screen with a panel that has a button that essentially transitions to a separate scene and a button that exits the application. If we switch to the pause screen and we switch to the result screen, we can take note that essentially these are more or less the exact same behaviors. So instead of writing 6 completely separate and custom nodes and writing 3 completely separate graphs that do basically the same thing, we're going to be a little bit smart here, and we're going to use a more abstract node to accomplish this behavior. Therefore, instead of generating a script that is called like subscribe to start screen buttons, instead what we're going to do is we are going to create a more generic name, which is something to the tune of subscribe button to swap scene. This allows us to, within the graph node, select which scene we want to write to, or select which scene we want to switch to, without having to hard code 3 separate scripts that are basically the same, with the small difference just being the name of the scene. This allows us to variabilize that. So the first thing we're going to do is, this is probably a good name, subscribe button to swap scene. The next thing I need to do is press space, add a colon, and then it is an abstract type called unit. This unit type is actually what C# uses to tell the compiler that this script is for creating a node. So now that I have subscribe button to swap scene set up, the next thing I do using my editor flow window, which is really nifty, is I hold Control and I press enter, and it automatically opens my script, which is pretty sweet. So now that the script is open, the first thing it's going to tell me is that the type unit is not understood. It has no clue what we're talking about. And for some reason it's not actually underlining it in red, but it should be. But oh, now it is, okay. So the first thing I need to do is add the abstract, or add the using statement to actually utilize this. So now that I have it highlighted, I will hold Control, I'll push period, and I will say using Unity visual scripting. And this will solve the abstract name, but it is going to now say that the concrete type has an unimplemented abstraction, which is what it says here. It does not implement inherited abstract member. So that's pretty simple. Once again, we select it, hold Control period, and we can go down to, or we don't even have to go down, we just say implement abstract class. Then we come in here and we can remove this exception. And the next thing we need to do is actually build the node. So there's a few things that the node is going to be using. The first thing Unity recommends is you don't actually have to serialize these nodes, which is nifty for performance. So we're going to start with an attribute that is do not serialize. The next thing we're going to do is, because this first instance is just a port trigger, we can actually say port label hidden, and this is going to tidy up the aesthetics of the node just a little bit. The next thing we're going to do is we have to actually add the input trigger for triggering this node through the flow of the script graph. So to do that, we say public, and we have to add a very particular type, which is control input. And for simplicity, I'm just going to simply call this control input. So real quick, if I save this and I jump back over to the editor, it is going to take a second to compile, and it's going to compile a little bit here, but that's fine. However, if I open up the script graph and I go in here and I try to find our type, which was subscribe to, or if I just go with subscribe, it doesn't even bring up any options. The reason for this is we added a new node, but we did not regenerate the nodes. So once again, we have to come up here to edit, project settings, and we have to click regenerate nodes. We have to give this a second to recompile. And it does wind up taking a second, which is kind of disappointing because it makes refactoring kind of strange, and it makes adding new behaviors to the script graph take a second. Like I added a couple lines of code for a new node, and that took 20 seconds. However, not to complain too much, now that that's actually completed, now let's give it a shot. And I come in here and I say subscribe, and there's our new node, subscribe button to swap scene. I'll pick this node, and even though the node is now set up, the port we added is not actually created yet, and that is because we have to come back to our script. We have to go into the graph, and we have to actually assign our control input. So to do that, I'll take the control input variable, and I have to say that it equals a control input. I have to name the control input using a string, And to name it, it's just use its own name, the variable's name itself, which is control input. And the control input is hassling me, so in order to, which it shouldn't be hassling me because it is the type up here. Did I spell it wrong? Control input. No, so let me see here, what's it telling me? If I select it and I push control period. So for some reason it is hassling me over the type. I'm not sure if it's just because it was going slow or not. Oh, okay. So the reason it's messing up is I did this a little bit out of order. So real quick, I'm actually going to comment this code out, and I'm going to come up here and I need to add another type. So to do that, I'm going to copy this, paste it down here to keep these two attributes. And then I'm going to use a new type here called a value input. And specifically, this value input is actually our button. So I'll just very simply call it button. And then down here, I need to take the button variable and assign it to a value input. And the type for that it's asking for is going to be button. And this button is actually not implemented yet, so once again, with the cursor next to the button, control period, and we need to add the using UI engine UI elements using to the top. Now the button is active. Then we need to specify the actual key for the button, which is just to say that it's called button. Kind of rote, but that's how it works. So that was my bad. I did forget one step there. Now we can come down here and take a quick look at this. If I uncomment this, the reason the control input is having a problem is because you not only need to add a key, but you actually have to add some kind of behavior. And the way that you add that behavior in this particular setup is you have to use a Lambda function. So to use the Lambda function within this function, I will say comma, and then I will surround the variable flow, which we have not defined yet. This defines the arbitrary input for the Lambda. I will do the equals greater than sign in order to actually be the Lambda function, and then I'll use braces to start writing the function. So I'll come in here, press enter. I'll come down here. And the next thing we need to do is actually assign some kind of behavior to the button. So to do that, we say flow, which is the incoming value, and then we type get value. And this allows us to grab some kind of input from the node, and that value that we're actually trying to grab is our button. So this is how you actually grab the button inside of the node variable. Once you have this selected, this has effectively been casted into a button. So we have to use the button's .clicked option to actually subscribe some kind of behavior to this. And the way we're going to subscribe that behavior is we are going to add an anonymous function to it. So to add an anonymous function to this callback, clicked callback, we will say plus equals, which allows us to assign some kind of function. And we are going to use empty parentheses to represent an anonymous function. And we're once again going to use the Lambda to start writing this. We'll come over here, write some braces, open up these braces. And now inside of here we can actually, and real quick, let me put a comma here, or a semicolon here. And for some reason it's giving me a little bit of an error for the Lambda flow. I'm not sure why that is. Let me see if I can go down here and type return null real quick. Okay. Here, let me take a look. It says, okay, it says that I actually need to add, okay, so I have to add the value input itself. which is our actual button. So if I put this button in here, it's actually going to stop complaining. Very good. Right, so now that we have this set up, essentially whatever we write here in this line is what is going to happen when we actually click the button we've selected. So I can do something really simple and say like a debug log, which is not going to let me. Let's see, if I do Unity engine debug log, we can come here and like say test, but pretty sure this is going to work, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, what we're trying to do is we are trying to swap to a different scene. And in order to swap to that different scene, we need to activate the scene manager and use the load scene function. So to get to that point, we will say Unity engine dot scene management dot scene manager dot load scene. Whoops. Whoa. Okay. And the easy thing here would be to say like game, and this would actually load our game scene. However, the plan was to make this a variable. So to make this a variable, our node needs to have a second value input that is a string value. So to create that value input, I'm going to come up here and copy paste this down here. I'm actually going to remove the port label hidden on this one because that will give us the ability to see which one is. It'll be more clear what variable we're typing into once we actually show the node. And for this, I'm just going to say scene name. So now we have a value input called scene name. And what I can do is come down here, and we can't just type scene name like this because we're inside of an anonymous function. It doesn't have the proper context. So we have to very specifically use the flow input variable, then say get value, and say that the value is a string, and then grab the particular value, which is actually our scene name. And that it actually delivers us whichever string we type into the node variable, the actual node variable slot that shows up on the node. And with this, we actually have completed our subscribe button to swap scene. So now that I've done this, I'm going to switch back to the editor. And as you've already seen, we now have a functioning control input, and we have a input for the button. What we're lacking though is the actual string input, which leaves me to wonder if I messed something up here actually. Oh, I did forget one thing. So the one thing I forgot was I actually have to come down here and initialize the scene name, even though I declared it. So scene name, the value input, string, and this one is scene name. Now that we've done this, come back to the editor. You have to give it a split second to compile. Open up the editor, and now we have our scene name properly set here. Although I did forget there's also one more thing I forgot, which is that even though we took the port label hidden off and it's showing our scene name, in order to open the port up, we have to add a second parameter here to our value input, and that is string.empty. Now that we have string.empty, if we come over to the editor, give it another split second to compile. We now have the scene name with a port here. So this allows us to actually, instead of having to like write 3 completely separate nodes, which are all exactly the same except for we type a different name here, we have now variabilized this name, and now we can actually reuse the port 3 separate times. And all we have to do is type that difference here. We don't have to write all the code again. And the scene that we want to switch to from the start screen when we push start is the actual game scene. So now that we have this written, we will drag the proper control flow ports into the nodes, and if you messed up the types, it won't let you do that, so it's a good sign that it all lined up. Alright, so this is probably going to be a good time to test everything. So we'll close this, and there's one more thing I need to do, which is, even though I've written it to switch the scenes, you have to actually make sure that you remember to add the scenes to the build settings. So I need to go to File, Build Settings, and I need to make sure that I add my start scene, my game scene, and for testing sake, let's see if I can add the pause and result scenes together, and yes I can. So now that I have these scenes added, when it actually goes into swap to the game scene, it actually knows what you're talking about because you've added it to the build settings. If you forget it, it won't work. It'll throw an error. Alright, so with that, as long as I haven't forgotten anything, let's give it a shot and let's see if this actually swaps. So if this works perfectly correctly, whenever we press the start button, we should switch to the game scene. And voila! We're in the game scene. So now I will exit the play mode, and the next step is going to be properly setting this up to work on the exit button, and also to continue this behavior on the other panels. So the way we're going to set up the exit button, because all three panels have the exit button, once again, instead of just copy pasting the script, we can create an a more abstract strategic node that is reusable. So we have to go through that process again. So let's click on Visual Scripting, go to my Editor Flow window, select Scripts. We can come back in here since we have the Visual Scripting directory selected, and we can simply change the end of this to say, so I guess we can say subscribe button to, and we'll just call it exit game. Then push Control and push Enter, and this will not only write the script, but it will open the script up for us. Super sweet. Okay, so then press the end key, bring it to the end, so we can push Control period to add the visual scripting using statement. Hold Control, push left 1, 2, 3, so we can use Control period to implement the abstract class. Come down here and we will scrap this. And then we need to start defining the control ports for making this subscribe properly to the button, which is actually very similar to what we just did. So to reiterate, we will say do not serialize because that helps with memory. We do not need to show the, we don't need to have a label for the control port because it's pretty obvious what it's doing. Then we'll come down here and we'll say public control input, and for simplicity we'll just say control input. That one's pretty straightforward. And then we'll have to come down here once again. We will say control input equals, and we do our control input and we name it use the control input key. And then we will have to define our lambda, but before I do that, let's make sure that we add the other ports that we need. So, to the same degree, we're going to have to query for the exit button this time, as opposed to the start button. So, to do that, we will do a copy paste here. Keep the do not serialize, keep the port label hidden, and then we have to actually make a value input. And this value input is once again the button. Now that the button is set up, we can come down here and say button equals value input of the type button. Hold the control period to make sure that we add the using Unity elements, or using Unity Engine UI elements. Then add the key as button. Now the port will show up our button properly. The next thing we need to do is we can uncomment this now, come down here and add the Lambda function. So we will say comma, put flow in parentheses, use the Lambda, create the brackets, open the brackets up, and inside of the brackets it's complaining because we haven't added a semicolon here. Now that we are inside of the brackets, once again we have to use the flow variable and say get value. And the value we're grabbing is a button, and that button is our button. Then we'll say clicked, and to the same degree we're going to subscribe to this action, and to subscribe to the action use the plus equals. And this is going to be another anonymous function. You use the lambda. open the brackets up and come down here, and we can actually use the semicolon again at that point. And this lambda is complaining because we have to, the flow wants to use, it's designed to use a return, this control input, it's designed to use a return value. That's a particular type of action it is. So the easy way to get that to stop complaining is to really quickly just come down here and say return null. Once we have that set up, now what we need to do is actually subscribe the behavior for closing the game. There are actually two ways to do this. So the first way to do it is you would come in here and you would say Unity engine dot application dot quit, and anytime that button is pressed, this will close the game. However, because I'm not actually building this as a full game, it's just an editor example, we need to create a way to very simply exit play mode in the editor. And there is a way to do that, and the way we do that, if I'm not mistaken, is we say Unity engine, and I do believe it's application. Is it application? Unity engine. I don't think it's just application. You say Unity engine. I was under the impression it was. Oh, excuse me. It's not Unity engine. It's Unity editor. So Unity editor, and it's like you say application. I'm actually kind of forgetting how to do this part here. You have to go into the Unity editor, and let me take a quick look for which option you're supposed to do. I know you say Unity editor, and then you go into something that lets you, it allows you to grab a Boolean property that will, that's called isPlaying, and you can simply set isPlaying to false. Let's see, is the editor application is playing? Okay, good. And then you say false. You know what this will actually do is, now what happens is whenever you click the exit button, we now have a node where any button you feed into it, if that button is pressed, it will it will basically exit play mode. That allows us to essentially just reuse this node in 3 different places. We don't have to copy paste all of this code. Alright, so now that that's set up, we will switch back to the editor, and it actually didn't complain about rewriting any scripts there, so that's nifty. But if we open up the script graph and we right click and we try to find that subscribe node, we still only have our original subscribe button to swap scene, and of course, if you've been paying attention, you understand that's because we have to regenerate our nodes. So edit, project settings, regenerate nodes. And once again, because we added one node, I'm assuming it has to like come in here and relink every single thing, which is not very efficient, but you're looking at like 20 seconds for every new node, whereas every new script, quote unquote, takes mere seconds or less. Unless you've got like a million scripts, then it takes forever, but this is not, it's not as quick to just add new code as comparable to typical C# scripting. However, now that we've set that up, we can go in here, right click, and real quick, I'll show you how to do it this way. If we click on variables, we can actually select, I'm actually not seeing it in here. Here we go, here's our custom ones. So there's a way to organize this better using attributes. However, for now it's easy enough to just select it from here, so we will click subscribe button to exit game. And the button we are trying to subscribe, of course, is our exit button. However, we don't actually have that button queried yet, so once again we need to right click and we need to do another uQuery extension. Make sure to select Q and the single class name option, because we don't need multiple class names tossed in there. So now we can connect this here, we can connect this here. Our name in this instance was exit button. However, now we have a little bit of an issue. Oh wait, one more thing is, we're using the same root visual element, so we can actually connect this here, which is convenient that we can split this like this. However, if I try to go to on start and run it like this, notice it breaks this connection. So you can't actually have, it doesn't work like this where you can tell start to do multiple things. You have to do it in a chain. And if you try to go from here, you break the subscription here also. So the only way to actually get this to chain properly is we have to chain it from our custom subscribe button to swap scene node. So to make this work, we have to add something called a control output as opposed to a control input, and that will essentially add one of these exit carrots to the side of our node. So let's open up Visual Studio, go over to our subscribe button to swap scene, and up here we need to add that code. So we're going to copy paste this down here. And it's actually pretty straightforward. You come down here to control input. If I select input and I hold shift alt and push period, it will select the next input character, so I can just simply type output one time. And this will give us a new option called a control output. So then I need to come down here and I need to actually create that control output. So I will say control output equals control output. And it's pretty straightforward. You come in here and you just say control output as a key. We now have a control output set up. And in order to pass the control output as a control flow, we need to come down here to our return null. And in this instance, we actually have something to return. And what it's returning is in fact our control output variable. So now in this instance, if I swap back to the editor, once it's done compiling, of course. Usually it does this compiling. The last time it didn't for some reason. So now I open up the editor, and now we have a control port. So now I can use this control port to continue the control flow into our new query. And as long as everything was set up properly, this should actually allow us to swap into the game scene, but also close play mode from our start screen. So I'm going to close the graph real quick, and we will give it a shot. So as we saw before, if I click start, swaps to the game scene, that's proper. If I enter play mode, and I click exit, it properly exits play mode, which is pretty sweet. I'm not quite sure what these are. This has something to do with the editor. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's something specific to UI elements. It hasn't been consequential. Alright, so now we have actually seen how to subscribe to the callbacks for these buttons, even though they are UI Builder buttons, UI Builder visual elements. So that's pretty cool. So to complete the video, now all we need to do is go into the pause scene, set up these buttons, and go into the result scene and set up these buttons. So that's not going to be too bad. We'll start with the pause scene, so we'll go to visual scripting. I'm going to grab the start screen script graph, select it, and I'm going to push Control D to duplicate for a new one. I will right click and I will rename this. I'll take the one off of the end, I'll go back to the beginning, and very, very simply, this is going to be the pause screen script graph. Then I will open up this script graph, and it is in fact the exact same graph. However, we have to do something a little different, and that is we have to set up our scene variable this time on a new graph. So we will say pause screen UI. It is going to be a UI document again. And in this case, once again, we grab the main camera's UI document. And just to make sure, let's select the main camera in the pause scene. And we do have a pause UI visual element, but I did forget. We need to actually also make sure we add a script machine. And in our script machine, make sure we add our proper pause screen script graph. Now that we've added the script graph, and we have the UI document queried properly, we need to go back into the pause screen script graph, and we need to make sure that we change our start screen UI to say pause screen UI. And we also need to make sure that we say in our subscribe button to swap scene, we don't want to swap to the game scene. We want to swap back to the start scene. And then the other thing we need to make sure is that we named our variables correctly in the scene. So start button, exit button. So let's go to our UI toolkit folder, open up our pause UI, and just double check real quick that we, okay, so for instance, this one's called return to start button. So let's open up the pause screen script, change this to return to start. Whoops. It's not letting me use the home button there. So return to start button, and this was still exit button. And by using the modular nodes, we didn't have to rewrite this code. We just had to change a couple things throughout the entire graph, but the whole thing was reusable, which is very convenient. There's actually probably an even more modular way to do this. There's a way to use graph variables and use a subgraph, and essentially you can wrap all this up in a subgraph and then expose this, this, and this, and this too. And you essentially just have like a list of 4 strings, and you can select the subgraph, and from the outside you can change all 4 of them. So there's an even cleaner way to do this, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. So now we're going to close this, and we are going to, from the pause scene, enter play mode, and we didn't add any nodes, so I don't have to recompile. I added the script machine. It's querying properly, so let's just take a look and see if this works. Give it a second to recompile here. Once it's recompiled, test that the exit button's working, which it is. Let's go back into play mode. And what should happen here is when I click return start, we should return to the start screen. Solid. And then if I click start, we should of course go into the game. So now you're seeing how the buttons are actually swapping us around. Very good, very good. All right, so last thing, of course, do this same exact thing for the result screen. And it's all going to be pretty much the same. So we add a script machine. We go down to visual scripting, grab our pause screen script graph, control duplicate, right click, rename it. Take the 1 and the space off at the end, push home, go to the beginning, change this to result screen, script graph. Open up the result screen script graph and do the same thing here. So click on scene, add a new scene variable, and this is going to be called result screen UI. It's going to be a type of UI document. And then we're going to choose our main camera, which has our UI document on it. Then here we will change pause to say result screen UI. And it's the same thing from the result screen, and we're going to move to this back to the start screen. So that's correct still. The only thing we need to double check is the name of our buttons, which I'm pretty sure those are also going to be the same. Let's double check though. So go to the result UI. And we have return to start button and exit button. So those are the same. So this graph is basically the exact same graph. So we'll open up the result screen script graph and just double check it's going to query, grab the root visual element, query the return to start button, which will subscribe it to switch to the start screen, and the exit will actually exit the game. So the last thing we need to do then is go to the main camera and make sure that we assign our result screen script graph to this component. And assuming I didn't forget anything, we'll click play and test to see if this works. Give it a second to do some recompilation. And once again, there's these weird artifacts from the UI elements. If we click exit, it properly exits. If we click play, and then click return to start, returns us to start. If we go to start, it actually brings us to the game, which is exactly what we want it to do. Alright, so that is the end of this first video on using visual scripting to create this behavior for this Pong recreation challenge. I'm probably going to have 2 more videos for setting all of this up in order to split this up, because it's already a 50-minute video. So I am going to call it good for now on this one. We managed to get everything done that I wanted. We created the graphs, and we created some scripts. and all 6 of our buttons are actually working properly. So if you actually like this content, if you found this content useful, don't be afraid to like, share, and subscribe to what I'm doing. And as always, if you're feeling up for it, do not be afraid to go and support me on the Patreon. I would really appreciate it. In the next video, I am going to add all of the player keyboard inputs using Visual Scripting Graph. So I'm going to use Visual Scripting Graph to access the inputs we defined in the input system. And I'm going to actually write the code and set up the nodes for responding to player keyboard input, which will be moving the paddles up and down and pausing, swapping back and forth between the pause screen and the game scene. All right, so with that, I'm going to call it for this video. Thank you very much for watching this. Do not be afraid to come check out the next video to see what I've got for you. Take care.